I'm talking to you though. You're the stats guy.
Yeah, we're trying to
You're
do.
the stats guy, and we're the homies.
What is up, homies? Um, so this video is going to be a little bit different than some of our normal videos. It's just going to be me. Maybe it's a stats detective, actually. We'll see what I decide to call it. But long story short, I decided to use inferential statistics and some different methodologies to try and predict NBA games, specifically playoff games that occurred right before and also including the Eastern and Western Conference Finals. So I think there's about 5 games before when I tried to do it, and then also the entirety of the Eastern and Western Conference Finals games. I was unsuccessful. We'll get into it, but um, basically I was no better than a coin flip, which is not good in terms of prediction, and statistically it's a really low bar. The 50% bar, and I wasn't able to do better than that. So we'll dig into why. We'll dig into things that I'm doing when predicting other sports right now that I didn't do here, and why they're better practices. Yeah, so stick around if you're interested in that stuff. But we're talking NBA, and my basketball lamp is finally relevant. I love this basketball lamp. It's been in all the videos I filmed here, but finally we're talking some basketball with the lamp. Let's go. So, the first thing to talk about here is the differences between prediction and analysis. So, what we normally do is analysis, which is to say, we're taking outcomes of games, we're taking the statistics accrued within those games and using them to predict outcomes, whether that be point differential, whether that be the binary outcome, whether that be a certain player's performance like QBR or passer rating. I don't like QBR. I don't know why I said that one first. Um, that is very different from prediction. And the reason is we have all the information because the game already happened. So, like for instance, when I did the analysis on QBR versus passer rating, we knew the outcomes of those games. All we had to do was plug in predictors, in that case, the statistical measures of quarterback performance, and then we could see how well each one predicts, quote unquote predicts. It's using a class of statistics called inferential statistics. That basically means that we're using data from the past to try and elucidate the future. The problem, especially in sports, with prediction is that you only have access to a very limited subset of variables that you know beforehand. So, for instance, when trying to predict NBA playoff games, I only had access to regular season stats and stats through the first 62 games of playoff play. Now, there's a huge problem with that. A couple of huge problems with that we'll get into in the future. Basically, it boils down to, in this case, you have all the statistics from the games that already happened. You know how well they shot from 3-point range. You know how many free throws they made. You can use that to analyze or infer how much that impacted the outcome. In this one, you only know the stats from previous games, previous seasons, or like an overall career statistic. So, for instance, one thing you might do in basketball is take the regular season 3-point percentage for a team and use that to try and predict outcomes. The problem is that's not necessarily helpful, because 3-point percentages game to game are widely variable. Um, Now, it is somewhat helpful in that teams tend to shoot better or worse based on the team that it is. Like, for instance, the Celtics shoot very well from three, at least they did during the regular season. And that seems to have carried over to the playoffs, but that's not true of every team. And in our last video that we did, we saw how bench scoring was impacted by going to the playoffs, and it took a huge dip. And that's why only having those predetermined variables that you know beforehand is sometimes useful and sometimes really not useful, because, like, for instance, if you try to use regular season bench scoring, it's probably not going to tell you a whole lot, because bench scoring across the board takes a huge dip. So you have to rely on other things. So not only is your subset of variables you have access to smaller, but the subset within that subset of variables that is even useful to you is teeny tiny. And so I'm going to go over all the variables I tested, which ones that we found were useful, which ones were not, and eventually the model that we settled on, or the algorithm that we settled on, and why it didn't really work. Let's talk about variable selection. Variable selection is its own field of statistics. There are a huge number of methodologies that you can use for variable selection. Um, but I will say that when it comes to prediction, variable selection is more of an art than a science. Because there's no way to systematically know whether or not a significant variable, even if in analysis it's significant, is going to lead to better predictions. So here are some of, not all of, but some of the variables that I chose to test to see whether or not that they would help with prediction. And as you can see, there are quite a few. So I definitely tried a bunch of different things. The two big ones that ended up being really useful were offensive and defensive ratings from the regular season and from the playoffs, and then the net ratings from the regular season and from the playoffs. Um, because of the way that I enter the data, it is all from the perspective of the home team. So it is possible, for instance, to do net rating and opponent net rating and see if they offset each other, see if they interact with each other, which ended up not being the case. But it's really useful because not only are you taking your team's stats into account, you can also take the opponent's team's stats into account. I also considered 3-point percentage, the matchup history in the regular season. Now, as you can see, this would be kind of a hit or miss thing because some of these teams play each other a lot before the playoffs, and some of them don't play each other very much for the playoffs. But since they're all in the same conferences, they played each other. I think everybody had a matchup history. I don't think any of the like Eastern teams didn't play each other. I'm pretty sure they all did. Um, the win percentage, that's from the regular season and up to that point in the playoffs. Number of all stars they had, number of bench points in the regular season and the playoffs, and free throw rate. So how many free throws per game and how many free throws you made per game, regular season, playoffs. Stocks, which is steals plus blocks, assists, and coaching records. So the coach of that team, how well do they usually do in the playoffs? How well do they usually do in the regular season, career, or just for the previous season? So again, a lot of things considered, and I'll be honest, my method was sort of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, just based on sort of a secondary or even tertiary knowledge of basketball. I just thought, what makes the most sense, and then plug those things in and try a ton of different combinations and see what works the best. And I will get into in the next section the problems with the approach I took. But in terms of the variables that I chose to um, possibly include, this is a pretty good list, and probably the list that will end up being, like, for instance, if I do the same thing next year, that will end up being most useful. So I don't think there was any problem with the variables I chose. Now, if there are some variables you think I should have gone with, or I should have also considered, please put those in the comments, because I can't think of everything, and there's not like a ready-made list of like, well, here are variables that you can know before the game starts. Yeah, there are also a certain number of variables that I couldn't include just because I'm one person entering data, and it would just be way too much work to go back and comb through all this stuff. So things like, and this is a big one, injuries. It is very difficult to quantify injuries because let's say that I went into every single game and I included the number of injured players on the roster. Well, is your injured player an all-star? Is your injured player a starter? Does your injured player get playoff minutes? Those things are very important. Now, even if I did something more subjective, like a significant injury, like for instance, when Tyrese Halliburton went down, that would definitely count as a significant injury. That's a high producing player. Um, I don't know how difficult it would be to go back for every single game and look at the injury history. I know that it exists, I know that it's out there, but the amount of time that it would take to do so is just not worth it for me. Maybe in the future, but we will see. But yeah, so injuries I think played a huge role in the playoffs. And speaking of Tyrese Halliburton, his quote I think was very good when he said that basically what he learned this year's playoffs is the healthy team wins. I would really like to test that hypothesis. I think it's a good one, and I might do some analysis, and I might use that ethos for future prediction because I think it's going to be really important, especially for the playoffs. Now, in a regular season game, the minutes are more spread around. Role players get a lot more touches and things like that. I think it means a little bit less if like your star player gets hurt or like just a starter gets hurt. I think it you take less of a hit, but in the playoffs, it certainly means a ton. So injuries is kind of the next thing I'm going to look at, but very difficult to quantify, very difficult to make a decision as to whether or not it's going to be predictive. But anyways, these are the variables that I went with, and I'm not going to tell you exactly which ones stuck and which ones I went with because I didn't do the rigorous testing necessary to actually know that information. I just sort of went with the model that I thought best. Well, it performed best in the initial testing, and then also my a prior knowledge of the sport made me think that it was a good algorithm. So I just sort of went with it. Clearly, that didn't work. So I'm not going to tell you exactly the model I went with, but needless to say, it was a subset of these and definitely included net rating. Now, one question you might have is, well, why don't you just include them all, right? More data is better. Well, when it comes to prediction, that's actually not always true. So, for instance, when you think of something like an r squared value, an r squared value, when you're talking about a linear combination of predictors, tells you the amount of variance, the percentage of variance that is explained by the different variables you chose. And by definition, if you include another variable, your r squared percentage goes up. But that doesn't always mean you have the best model. So there are other ways of deciding whether or not your model is best. Those being something like AIC or r squared that is adjusted for multiple variables. Um, I didn't, however, look at any of those things because those are built more for analysis than for prediction. So when you're talking about prediction, it's much better practice to test on a subset of games that you have not included as part of the data and see how well those are predicted by the combination of predictors you chose. I did not do that because I didn't have enough data. So basically, um, I didn't end up doing this round of predictions correctly or rigorously, as you might say, because of the limited data. I only chose to enter the first 62 games of playoff play, and there's a huge issue with that. And the issue is the first couple rounds are typically much easier to predict because the seedings are much different, right? Now, this year and in past couple years, I can remember seedings have been a little wonky and good teams get lower seeds. So there's definitely room for error there. But when you're talking about like the 1 versus the 8 and the 2 versus the 7, those are pretty much gimmies. And it would have really boosted my prediction probably if I had included those games. But instead, I chose to use those games as data. And there's a huge problem with that because when you're using games with a huge team disparity in terms of skill or just level of play, it brings in a level of noise that does not help when you're talking about teams with a very similar skill levels. So, like in the finals, you expect that they're two of maybe the top 3 or 4 best teams in the NBA, and so the level of play and the skill and the coaching and everything is kicked up a notch, and the differences are really tiny. When you're talking about like the 1 versus 8 matchup, that difference is going to be really wide. So, for instance, my model was trained on predicting easier matchups to predict, and so it didn't allow for these sort of differences I'm talking about, the granularity of differences that I needed. So Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider with prediction, and especially with sports, because sports is a special case, I would say. None of these methods are built for sports prediction. None of these methods are fine tuned to find differences like that. So it's just it's something you really have to think about when you're going into it and make sure that you're doing everything correctly, which I did not, and that's why this prediction didn't go super well. But let's get into exactly how well this prediction did. This section is called Things I Should Have Done because my prediction algorithm was only successful 50% of the time. 50% is super low when it comes to prediction. Super low. Because that's exactly as good as you could do if you just flipped a coin for every game and chose based on that. In fact, it's probably less than you would do if you did something very simple like picking every home game. Because even though everyone likes to say home field advantage or home uh, arena advantage in the NBA does not exist anymore, and especially not in the playoffs, I think it's a little better than 50%. In baseball right now, which by the way, I am actively working to do something better and a little bit more rigorous, and I'm having a lot more success. It's about 52%. So even if you just took 2 percentage points, that's better than what I had. So basically, my model settled on a bunch of regular season stats, like net rating, number of all stars, free throws. All those things ended up being significant, and all those things did tend to move the needle in terms of getting better predictions. But some things that I didn't do that I definitely should have, but either didn't have the time for or just didn't have enough data available to pull it off, was something like a test train model. So typically when you're doing prediction, and especially logit prediction, which is what I did, that is to say logistic regression prediction, you it's good practice to specify a training model and a testing model on which to um, use the training model and see how well it did. That's basically like your R squared value or something. So how well you were able to predict your positive predictive value, your negative predictive value, those are all really important stats to look at when you're trying to do prediction, and that's only something you can do if you use a test train method. Another thing I could have done is use past data. I only used data from these playoffs, and I only used the first 62 games of play. Why did I do 62? Well, because when I decided to like dive headfirst into this, they were 62 games in, so I just entered all the data from those games and went from there. 62 points of data is not huge. So what I could have done is tried to use regular season data, or if I was really smart about it, I could have used all the games from the previous season's playoffs, and then from that regular season test the model, and then apply that model to this postseason, and go from there. I did not do that, and so I was left with a limited number of data points, and that was just not good for overall prediction. And lastly, there are some advanced methods that I could have used to sort of get around the sticking points. Those specific, well, the ones that I know how to do are like cart and random forest, and those would have been really useful in terms of picking variables because the way I went about it was very meticulous and time consuming. And basically, I was just using combinations of variables that made sense to me. And that's not always the best way to go about things because sometimes there's a hidden gem in terms of a statistic that you're not thinking about. So that basically wraps up this first part of prediction. When I talk to you next one on one, it will probably be about predicting MLB games. And like I said, I'm having a lot more success with that. And partly because of this thing, which is the data issue. In the NBA, I probably have to go back in time and grab data from previous seasons and previous playoffs. In the MLB, they play a buttload of games, just so many games. And there is plenty of data, even though they're only, I don't know, each team has played like 40 something games, maybe 50. Even though they're only like a third of the way through the season, That is so much data. Like that is almost they are right now pushing the number of games that you had total in the MLB, and when they're done, they're going to be right at like double that amount of data. So plenty. Where I foresee issues is the NBA probably has enough data, especially if I use previous seasons, but the NFL, there are only 250 something. I think it's 250 something games, or maybe 270. I can't remember the exact number, but there's only a certain number of games in the NFL, and that's just not a whole lot of data points. Now, the nice thing about the NFL and about the MLB is that instead of a roster, a lineup, you have specific players that you know are going to play or that you know did play. In the case of past data, and those are quarterbacks and pitchers. Now, that could be the key to breaking this whole thing wide open because while I don't know how many shots, let's say Kevin Durant is going to take in a game, I know that a starting pitcher is going to throw right around, at least 50 pitches or so. And that is huge in terms of prediction because I can use that player's past performance and I can use that player's performance up to that point in the season in order to tell me how well I think he's going to perform in this game. But that doesn't exist in the NBA, which makes it just a little bit harder to know what's going to happen in the game. Oh, one thing quickly I forgot to mention is that while the model was tested and used on um, everything from the Western and Eastern Conference Finals and a couple of games before that, it incorrectly predicted the Mavs beating the Timberwolves. The Timberwolves had great regular season stats, and the model really liked the Timberwolves. And so it took a hit. That's probably why it's so low. But it did like the Celtics. And for the finals, which have not yet happened, it has predicted a Celtics sweep. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. But assuming that the Celtics win, this 50% will definitely be higher. And especially if they win in 4 or 5 or even 6, it could be much higher than this, depending on how the numbers shake out. So I might do a short video reporting at the end of the finals whether or not this improved. I suspect it will because I do suspect that the Celtics are going to win. But who knows? And again, another issue with the model and why it didn't pick the Mavericks was because Mavericks during the regular season were, so. They definitely got into the playoffs, but they had a huge push at the end of the season, and this did not take that into account. So that's definitely something I'll think about in the future is like weighting the end of the season higher than the beginning of the season and things like that. But anyways, so model likes the Celtics. Do with that what you will. I might report at the end if this ends up being a lot better. But see you next time.